Hi, guys. So, what you're about to watch is a lecture from my course Shakespeare and the History of the English Kings, which I teach at Kepler Education. This lecture is actually from a past year, so I'm going to have updated, revised lectures for this coming year. But I thought I would put this one out as a sample for anybody who's interested in taking the class, if you're a homeschool student or if you're a parent who has students who you are homeschooling. Hopefully, this will give you a sample of what the course is like. Thanks. This is the longest of the history plays, and the second longest of all of Shakespeare's plays, behind only Hamlet. It was also Shakespeare's first major hit. Up until this play, he'd performed the Henry VI trilogy, which has never been as popular as some of his later works. And he'd put on a few comedies, such as Love's Labour's Lost and The Comedy of Errors. But Richard III was really the first of the handful of great plays that people tend to think of when thinking about Shakespeare. One thing to notice about it is that it depicts the end of the dynastic line that we've been following all throughout these plays. The Plantagenets had been ruling on the throne of England since 1154, for around 300 years, and after the events of this play, the new ruling dynasty would be the Tudors. This was the same dynasty that was ruling in Shakespeare's day. So you might imagine that a play depicting the overthrow of the old rulers by the current ones would be more aware of its audience, more cautious of giving offense than any of the ones that we've read thus far. The man who eventually defeats Richard in Act 5, Henry the Earl of Richmond, was the grandfather of the current reigning monarch, Queen Elizabeth. So it would only stand to reason that the last Plantagenet had to be portrayed as someone who was thoroughly wicked, corrupt, a morally depraved ruler whose overthrow was justified. And that's partly why we get the depiction of the devilish Richard that we have in the play. Even though it's unarguably a great work of art and stands on its own merits as such, many historians see this play as a specimen of Tudor propaganda. The historical sources that Shakespeare drew from were in themselves hostile toward Richard, even though they were firsthand accounts of the events of the play. So a lot of these sources were people who were either descended from those who fought on Richmond's side or who were on Richmond's side. One of the writers that Shakespeare used, Thomas More, actually grew up in the household of one of the characters in the play, the Bishop of Ely, who we see defecting over to Richmond's side near the end. So many make the argument, and I think it's a fair argument to make, that the real life Richard III wasn't anywhere near as much of a monster as his reputation suggests to us. But then again, there's evidence to suggest that his monstrousness wasn't all a complete fabrication either. For a long time, these defenders of Richard even posited that he never had any physical deformities, that he didn't have a hunchback or a withered arm, and that this was all just a part of the smear campaign against him. But with the recent discovery of his long lost skeleton, which we'll talk about in a future lecture, it's a really cool history, we now know that his physical appearance probably did fit the description that we read about in the play. All this is to say that what we read about in Richard III, like what we read in the other plays, isn't entirely true, but it's not entirely false either. And I think the fun of reading them is choosing how much of it you want to believe is true, especially when the historical accounts leave room for some doubts. But that's just something that I wanted to make you aware of all the same. One thing to notice about the first act is that the timeline in it is a bit muddled. It's covering events that span around 8 years, and if we're going to be reading the play while sticking to the true chronology, Scene 2 of Act 1, the one where Richard is wooing Lady Anne, would have to come first. Remember that at the end of the last play, we were in the year 1471. In Scene 2, when Richard intercepts the funeral procession for King Henry VI, only 3 months have passed since then. King Henry, obviously, still hasn't been laid to rest, and Richard himself mentions that 3 months ago he killed Prince Edward at Tewkesbury, which we read about last time. Scenes 1, 3, and 4 of Act 1 are taking place much later, in 1478. That's why in these scenes, everyone's talking about King Edward as if he's on his deathbed. They're saying that he's sort of let his health go to rot. He's had a bad diet, he's lived a life of debauchery, and now he's weak and old. And that's a far cry from the Edward that we just read about at the end of Henry VI, Part 3, who was an active, valiant warrior, you'll remember. So obviously, a lot of time has passed because you don't go from an athlete to an unhealthy glutton overnight. And these scenes are also concerned with the imprisonment and assassination of George, Duke of Clarence, which also occurred in 1478. For the past 8 years, Clarence had really made something of a nuisance of himself. He never reconciled himself to the Queen's family and was very public about his disdain for them. Now, he wasn't the only one in this regard. As we learned from the play, other nobles didn't like the upstart Woodville family either, such as Lord Hastings, Buckingham, and Richard himself. But Clarence wasn't very well liked by anybody, not even the commoners. After the death of his wife, who you'll remember was Warwick's other daughter, he sort of went crazy and he gave his brother, the king, plenty of reason to want to lock him up in the tower. He accused one of his wife's maids of poisoning her, and he had her executed without the king's permission, with only a semblance of a trial. It was kind of a sham trial that he put on. The maid didn't really have her fair day in court. And this was something that infuriated the commoners, and it reflected badly on the royal family, too. And he also publicly argued with Edward when he wanted to remarry, and Edward wouldn't grant him permission. So there were a lot of legitimate reasons for wanting Clarence imprisoned that the play doesn't really hint at. But again, all this happened over a period of time. The three sons of York didn't go from being a tight-knit group to enemies overnight. Another thing to notice about the first act is that it sets in motion the two forces that we can picture really as guiding the action throughout the rest of the play. Everything that happens afterward can be read in the light of one of these two forces acting out its will. The first of these forces is Richard, and the second is Margaret. And we're going to look at both of them in turn. So in the last play, you'll remember that Richard made a speech where he described himself as a Machiavel. And we didn't really talk about it then, but now I want to dwell on that word a bit, because it gives us an important key to understanding Richard's character. So Niccolò Machiavelli was an Italian Renaissance philosopher, best known for his work called The Prince. He viewed politics really not through a moral lens, but through a utilitarian one which basically said that the ends justify the means. He wrote that for someone to succeed as a politician or as a ruler, they would have to make use of deception, crime, and violence in order to gain and retain a high position of power. Now, it's important to note that this wasn't something Machiavelli encouraged or recommended, but simply what he saw as being the case of fact after years of serving in public office. In The Prince, he claims that a ruler, such as a king, will have to act deceitfully at times and unscrupulously, and that it's better to be widely feared than greatly loved, because fear of punishment is greater than the obligation one would feel to be loyal to a personally benevolent ruler, such as Henry VI. And we saw that that was kind of true in the last few plays. Henry VI was a great guy, but no one really respected him, and so he lost his kingdom, and everything broke down into chaos. So we can see why Richard would call himself a Machiavel. He's applying these principles to his own situation expertly, though historically Richard III lived before Machiavelli, so the reference is an anachronism. Machiavelli is sometimes called the father of modern political philosophy, and we can picture Richard in this play as standing for or representing the emergent modern way of thought. He's completely cast off the old worldview that was still present back in Richard II, the view of a universe ordered and maintained by God, in which people are praised according to their morals and their virtues. He's very forward-looking. All of his schemes and plans are for the future, and there's a sort of hurried energy to all of his actions and speeches. We can tell that he's constantly thinking about the next step in his plans. Like in the last play, he makes us his confidant, revealing his true self in soliloquy when he has a stage to himself. And that's actually how this play begins. He comes out and gives a very famous soliloquy that reveals what his plans are for seizing power, also why he wants to seize power, and also, more importantly, why he feels justified in doing so. He talks about how nature cheated him by giving him such a misshapen appearance, and that because of this, he will never be able to live comfortably in the rosy, peaceful times that he's now in. So he blames nature, and in effect God, for making him what he is, and saying that really he has no choice but to play the villain. He says, "Now is the winter of our discontent made glorious summer by the sun of York, and all the clouds that lowered upon our house in the deep bosom of the ocean buried. Now are our brows bound with victorious wreaths, our bruised arms hung up for monuments, our stern alarms changed to merry meetings, our dreadful marches to delightful measures. Grim-visaged war hath smoothed his wrinkled front, and now, instead of mounting barbed steeds to fright the souls of fearful adversaries, he capers nimbly in a lady's chamber to the lascivious pleasing of a lute. But I, that am not shaped for sportive tricks, nor made to court an amorous looking-glass, I, that am rudely stamped, and want love's majesty to strut before a wanton, ambling nymph, I that am curtailed of this fair proportion, cheated of feature by dissembling nature, deformed, unfinished, sent before my time into this breathing world scarce half made up, and that so lamely and unfashionable, that dogs bark at me as I halt by them. Why I, in this weak, piping time of peace, have no delight to pass away the time unless to spy my shadow in the sun and descant on mine own deformity. And therefore, since I cannot prove a lover to entertain these fair, well-spoken days, I am determined to prove a villain and hate the idle pleasures of these days. Plots have I laid, inductions dangerous, by drunken prophecies, libels, and dreams, to set my brother Clarence and the king in deadly hate the one against the other. And if King Edward be as true and just as I am subtle, false, and treacherous, this day should Clarence closely be mewed up about a prophecy which says that G of Edward's heirs the murderer shall be." And he's, of course, referring there to the false prophecies put out that Clarence, or George as his name is, that's why G's important, is going to do something to harm Edward's heirs. So a lot in the speech, again, it seems like he's trying to justify doing what he's about to do. It's almost like he's working himself up through bitterness and self-pity to be hard-hearted enough to do the evil deeds that he has planned. But later in the play, we get evidence that his life isn't all that bad. Or if it is, it's because of his personality, not because of his appearance, like he says. He spends so much time in that speech talking about how no woman will ever love him, how he's not made to woo the ladies. But then in the very next scene, he charms Lady Anne into softening her hatred towards him, and even to being open toward his advances. And even he's surprised when this happens. So again, it's almost like his constant belittling of himself is a self-deception that he practices in order to feel better about doing the things that he does. And I think it's interesting to compare Richard to one of our past kings, Henry V. Even though they're so different, Henry is arguably the best king that we've read about, and Richard is the worst. They both share similar ways of thinking and manipulating others. Richard, like Henry, is putting on a show for the world, while only revealing his true self to us in soliloquy. Remember that Hal was acting like a ruffian, a rogue, and a scoundrel, but then he confided to the audience that really this was all an act, a means to an end. Richard does the same thing, but it's reversed. He tells us that he's planning nothing but ruin and destruction for those around him, but outwardly he's a loyal subject, a devoted brother, and a plain-spoken, even religious individual. Later on, still talking about how he's going to betray Clarence, he says this, "Clarence, who I indeed have cast in darkness, I do beweep to many simple gulls, or dopes, namely to Derby, Hastings, Buckingham, and tell them 'tis the Queen and her allies that stir the King against the Duke my brother. Now they believe it, and withal wet me to be revenged on Rivers, Dorset, Grey, the Queen's allies. But then I sigh, and with a piece of scripture tell them that God bids us do good for evil, And thus I clothe my naked villainy with odd old ends stolen forth of holy writ, and seem a saint when most I play the devil. And so Richard shares this sense of play acting with Hal, and he also shares Hal's sense of theatrics. Remember that Hal loved to stage scenes or plays, mostly with Falstaff, though when he did this, it was mostly just for fun. In this play, we'll see that Richard is an expert at the art of stagecraft. He knows how to win an audience, to set up a scene and tell a narrative. He's already doing it in Act 1, but it will be even more apparent later on in the play when he's working with the Duke of Buckingham. He even shares Hal's sense of self-deprecation. The scene with the wooing of Lady Anne could be compared to Hal's wooing of Lady Catherine in Henry V. They both talk down their own personal appearances, and they profess themselves to be plain-spoken, honest soldiers and devotees of the women. So, if Henry V could be considered the great Christian king, as we've talked about, we can perhaps think of Richard as the opposite, or the anti-Christian king. They share a lot in common, but whereas Henry uses his personal traits and accomplishments for good, Richard uses them for evil. So, Richard is one of the two forces controlling the events in this play. He's sort of the stage manager, the puppeteer, hiding in the shadows and laying his plots, which the other characters fall into. And the other force, as I mentioned earlier, is Margaret. And while Richard, as I've said, can be seen as representing modernity or the future, Margaret acts in this play as a specter of the past. She's still alive, but all of the energy and will she possessed in the last few plays is now drained from her. She's a ghost of her former self, and she might as well be a ghost in general. She doesn't have a huge role in the play, but in Act 1, she comes out and invokes a curse on all the other characters that we see in the scene, and this curse we'll watch as it plays itself out all the way up to the end. If Richard's scheme is one puppeteer, one driving force, Margaret's curse is another. The curse propels the action, in other words. She walks into the throne room while Richard, Buckingham, and others are feuding with the Queen and her family members. They're all at each other's throats, and then when she speaks up, they immediately forget their quarrel and they gang up on Margaret. Ironically, she makes peace between the two factions through their mutual hatred of herself. And she responds to this with this curse that places accountability and guilt on the heads of everyone there for what's happened to her husband and her son in the last plays. She says, "What? Were you snarling all before I came, ready to catch each other by the throat and turn you all your hatred now on me? Did York's dread curse prevail so much with heaven that Henry's death, my lovely Edward's death, their kingdom's loss, my woeful banishment, should all but answer for that peevish brat," talking about Rutland, who you'll remember she killed? "Can curses pierce the clouds and enter heaven? Why then give way, dull clouds, to my quick curses. Though not by war, by surfeit die your king, as ours by murder to make him a king. Edward, thy son," she's talking now to Queen Elizabeth, "that now is Prince of Wales, for Edward our son, that was Prince of Wales, die in his youth by like untimely violence. Thyself a queen," again talking to Elizabeth, "for me that was a queen, outlive thy glory, like my wretched self. Long mayest thou live to wail thy children's death, and see another, as I see thee now, decked in thy rights as thou art stalled in mine. Long die thy happy days before thy death, and after many lengthened hours of grief, die neither mother, wife, nor England's queen. Rivers and Dorset, you were standers by, and so wast thou, Lord Hastings, when my son was stabbed with bloody daggers. God, I pray him that none of you may live his natural age, but by some unlooked accident cut off." So you can imagine that all these other nobles are watching Margaret really give it to Queen Elizabeth, and they're just kind of, enjoying the show, and then she just turns around and starts pointing at them and cursing them too. So they're all probably turning pale in the face. And Richard at this point tries to stop her. He says, "Have done thy charm, thou hateful withered hag." And Margaret turns around and looks at him and says, "And leave out thee? Stay, dog, for thou shalt hear me. If heaven have any grievous plague in store exceeding those that I can wish upon thee, O let them keep it till thy sins be ripe, and then hurl down their indignation on thee, the troubler of the poor world's peace. The worm of conscience still bid gnaw thy soul. Thy friends suspect for traitors while thou livest, and take deep traitors for thy dearest friends. No sleep close up that deadly eye of thine, unless it be while some tormenting dream affrights thee with the hell of ugly devils. She curses everybody, and for the rest of this play, like I said, we see this curse being acted out. There's a long history in drama of utilizing the fulfillment of a curse as a driving plot, going all the way back to the ancient Greeks, really. The Orestia trilogy by the playwright Aeschylus is all about a curse that lingers over the house of Atreus and manifests itself in one revenge killing after another. And we saw in the last play how one act of cruelty brought down vengeance, or judgment, however you want to look at it, on the heads of the perpetrators from heaven by the hand of someone who, in turn, has a curse invoked on themselves. All of this is to say that Margaret's curse is coming from that older worldview, that more ancient time. It has, to an extent, the backing of God, because it's punishing those who have behaved monstrously in the last play. It's really kind of hard to pity the victims of Richard's schemes because there's a sense of poetic justice in the ends that they meet. And this is evident with Clarence, who tries to plead with the murderers that Richard has go to the tower to kill him. Clarence says, "You shouldn't do this. God will take vengeance on those who break his laws," and he's meaning, of course, those who murder. And the murderers hurl right back at him. God takes vengeance on those who perjure themselves by breaking vows sworn to him, which you did. So here's the vengeance. Well, and then Clarence tries to say, well, that may be true, but vengeance belongs to God. You shouldn't have a hand in it. And the murderers, again, say, oh, that's weird, because you claimed it was God's vengeance when you killed Prince Edward in front of his mother with your own hand. So again, his own standard condemns him. And when we see the Woodvilles falling prey to Richard's plans, we can also read it as them falling prey to Margaret's curse. The same thing goes for Hastings and for King Edward as well. So throughout this play, try to imagine how any particular reversal of fortune or death that certain characters face can be interpreted as the acting out of either Richard's will or Margaret's. I think it's an interesting way to read the play. So for next time, read Acts 2 and 3, where we'll see the curse, the hammer stroke of the curse start to fall. And we'll take it from there. Thanks.